Hello, in this tutorial, we will use IAM Role for a common use case where an IAM user in one AWS account needs to access resources in another AWS account. Examples include consultants working on your project or a SaaS application that needs access to monitor resources in your AWS account. One of the advantages of using an IAM role for this use case is that you don't have to hand out long-term credentials like username and password or access keys. Now let's build a solution using IAM role to grant access across AWS account. For this demonstration, we have two accounts. On the left, we have the Studio account, and on the right, we have the Acme AWS account. This is the account that contains Troy's IAM user. So in order to allow Troy to assume a role and get access to our S3 bucket, we need to do a couple of things here. First, on the Studio account, we're going to set up a role called Studio Acme Consultant role. This is the role that Troy will assume to get access to the Project X resources. One of the things that Studio Acme Consultant role will have is a trust relationship. Namely, it'll trust the users coming from Acme account. The other thing that role will have is a policy called Studio Project X policy. This policy allows S3 actions on com.studio project X resource. And finally, we have the S3 bucket resource itself, namely com.studio.projectx. So whoever assumes the Studio Acme Consultant role will be allowed to access the Project X bucket. Now on the Acme side, Troy needs a permission to assume a role. We will create a policy called Acme Client Assume Role Policy. This policy will allow assume role action for the resource Studio Acme Consultant role. Notice that this resource is pointing to a role that belongs to Studio account. So with this setup, Troy should be able to assume a role called Studio Acme Consultant role. Then he should be able to access the Project X S3 bucket. Notice on the Studio account, we will not create a Troy IAM user. Studio will not give Troy a long-term credential like username, password, or access key in order for Troy to access Project X resources. So now I'm on the AWS console, logged in as root user on Studio account. So let's start with the resources. Here are three S3 buckets, and the one we're interested in is com.studio.projectx bucket. Inside these buckets are three objects. So these are the objects that we need Troy to get access to. Let's look at our policy. If you look at this policy, you can see that this policy has two statements. First statement is to allow all S3 action for com.studio.projectx bucket and all of its objects inside. The second statement is to allow users to navigate S3 buckets when they log into AWS console. Now that we have the S3 bucket resource and the policy, let's create a role. I'll create a brand new role, and the type of trusted entity is another AWS account. We need to know Acme's AWS account ID. In real world, this will be an account ID that Acme company will provide to Studio. So we will enter that ID here. So again, this is Acme's account ID. As for permission, we will attach the Studio Project X policy we just looked at. And again, this policy allows S3 actions on the Project X bucket. We'll skip the tags for now. And we will name this role Studio Acme Consultant role. As a good practice, we'll also put description. The purpose of this role is to allow Acme consultants access to the resources that they need for the Project X. So let's go ahead and create this role. So now we have Studio Acme Consultant role. Let's look at this role and take a look at the trust relationship. If you click on the trust relationship and click Edit Trust Relationship, you will see a policy that describes the trust relationship. So this statement says, allow assume role action for principal, namely the IAM users from Acme's account, root. The root notation denotes that this policy trusts any IAM user from Acme's account. So now that we have the trust relationship configured and the permission policy configured, We are now done with Studio's AWS account setup. Now let's go to Acme's AWS account. Now I'm logged in as root user to the Acme's AWS account. Just to make sure, you can go to Support Center, and you'll see the account number. So this account number here is the account number for Acme's AWS account. So here on the Identity and Access Management dashboard, let's go look at the users. Here we can see Troy's IAM user. And currently he has no permission. He doesn't belong to any groups. So he really can't do anything. So at this point, we need to grant Troy permission to assume a role. So in order to do that, let's go and create a policy. Let's create a new policy, and I'm going to paste this policy here. So this policy has one statement which allows assume role action for the role resource. The resource points to a role that is created in the Studio's AWS account. Just to make sure, you can see that the role that resource is referencing by Amazon resource name is exactly same as the actual role that was created in the Studio account. So let's review this policy. And we will name this policy Acme Client Assume Role Policy and create it. So now we have our policy created. Let's go back to our Troy user and let's attach the policy to Troy. So here's the policy we just created, and let's add it to Troy's permission. So now what we've done is we have given Troy permission to assume a role, namely the role that is created on the Studio's account. So now let's log in as Troy and see if this works. So I'm going to log in as Troy on my right browser, and on my left browser, I'm logged in as a root user into the Studio's AWS account. Okay, when Troy first logs in, navigates to Acme's S3 service, he gets access denied because he has no permission to do anything with S3. Now let's try to assume the role Studio Acme Consultant role. So he'll switch role, and he needs two pieces of information. First is the account number for Studio. Someone will have to give him this information. And the second piece of information is the name of the role, Studio Acme Consultant role. Notice that this is the exact role that we created on the Studio side. We'll pick a different color and switch role. And look at that. Now, Troy has access to the S3 buckets that are in the Studio account. And just to make sure, if I navigate to Studio account on the left side, you can see that these are the exact 3 buckets that are in the Studio account. And now Troy can see the same bucket. Furthermore, he's able to navigate to com.studio.project bucket, and now he's able to see and work with these objects. However, if he tries to navigate to other buckets, like consulting bucket, he gets access denied. Same with engineering. That's because on the Studio side, the role that he's assuming has one policy, and this policy says he only has full access to the Project X bucket. So now to summarize, Troy was able to access the S3 bucket resources across the account. And on the Studio side, we didn't have to create an IAM user for Troy and give him username password into Studio account or access key. Troy was able to access the resource that he needs for Project X just by assuming the role. If you want to learn more about IAM, check out the Udemy course named AWS Identity and Access Management Practical Applications. The link is in the show notes below. This course covers IAM role more in depth, in addition to IAM user, group, and policy. Also, diagrams and policies used in this demo are available in the blog post in the link below. Thanks for watching.